a little bit of context on how I got into MiResource and some of the kind of complicated problems that we've had to solve over the years and what we learned from that. But really, I think it's more fun if this is more of a conversation. It's actually great that this is a smaller group because I'd love to hear from you guys what you're interested in learning about MiResource and what we've learned over the years. So if you have any questions, I would love to hear those. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the things that I think have been most interesting from a learning perspective that you guys might be interested in. And then I'd love to open it up to more of a conversation, if that sounds good to you guys. So I got introduced to the mental health care system through my sister. And my sister, Shelby, struggled with depression, anxiety, and an eating disorder. And we thought we were really lucky that we grew up next to an amazing healthcare system and a university hospital system in Northern California. And we thought we were lucky that my sister really wanted to get better and that our family was very on board with getting her whatever help she needed. Her doctors tried really hard, but despite all of this, we were completely ping-ponged around the mental health care system. Shelby went through many different therapists, 3 different psychologists, 3 different psychiatrists, was in and out of the hospital all the time. And we ultimately failed to find her the right care. And in 2014, we lost Shelby to suicide. And I was a freshman at Duke at the time, and I was just beside myself at why we weren't able to find her the right care, because we were so lucky that her doctors were all trying super hard. Everyone cared so much. But we still failed and we never found Shelby the right care. And so I spent the next 3 years really learning everything I could about what goes into connecting someone to the right mental health care. And I spent a lot of time just talking to anyone I could get my hands on about how to connect people to mental health care and how the mental health care system worked. And pretty early on, it became really clear to me that there were really these 2 major problems within mental health care. One is that in order to get connected to the right clinician or the right type of mental health care, you have to be able to first correctly identify what it is you're struggling with and then what the best type of care is. And then you have to be able to actually connect with that therapist and find that clinician, or maybe it's a more intensive form of care in your community or something that's accessible to you. And being super naive at the time, I thought, you know what, this sounds like a data maintenance problem to me. And I think that this seems super solvable. We just need to create a database system that can maintain all these data points. And so I, not having any sort of technical background, jumped into trying to build this system. And the other component to this is being at Duke is I went to the counseling center and I asked them, how do you guys connect people to care? Because students are actually incredibly lucky to have the counseling center, because you don't see anywhere else in the mental health care system of someone who's fully dedicated to trying to help you understand what you're struggling with and then connect you to care. That's called like a referral coordinator. And so I wanted to learn from them. So I spent a lot of time on the phone calling up 300 different university counseling centers. Sorry if you can hear my dog in the background. He's whining. I'm not entirely sure why. The benefits of working from home with pets. And I then was talking to these counseling centers just to understand, like, these are supposedly the experts at connecting people to care. How do they do it, and what are the problems that they face? And how are they going about trying to solve this sort of data maintenance problem of understanding where these clinicians are in the local community? And it became clear to me very quickly that this is something that they also struggle with. So after talking to 300 different counseling centers, there were definitely commonalities amongst what people were saying. And I pulled a team together and we started building MiResource. But there were some big problems that showed up very quickly, because ultimately we're building a 2-sided marketplace. And with 2-sided marketplaces, you get this problem of, you have the chicken and the egg problem. How do you get all these therapists to join your platform when they are not only convincing someone why they should spend 5, 10, 20 minutes trying to sign up on your system, which sounds like not much time, but if you think about it, that's a lot of time as someone who might be signing up for something. And then another component of this is that mental health providers tend to be individuals who don't particularly love technology or not the most technologically savvy individuals. A lot of times prefer more like analog things like writing down on a pad of paper. And how are we going to get those individuals to sign up in our system when we don't even have patients yet? Because we can't go to patients and say, hey, we've got clinicians. You know, you have to have clinicians before you can recruit patients, and you have to have patients for the clinicians to actually be interested. And what we ended up figuring out is if we could license our software to these university counseling centers, we could help the counseling centers keep the information on their local mental health providers up to date. And more importantly, the counseling center had a very close relationship with these local therapists, and that the therapists really liked the counseling centers because those counseling centers sent students to their practices. But one contradictory piece of information we were getting from the mental health care system was that therapists don't need more patients. We kept hearing this over and over again. The system is at maximum capacity. You know, we don't have enough therapists. There's more patients than there are therapists. But there's an interesting nuance to this. And as we dug deeper, we realized that it's not that their therapist practices are full, it's that they're full at certain times. Everyone generally wants to see a therapist in the evenings after work, but during the day, therapists tend to have openings. And what's beautiful about students is they have more flexible schedules. They can see therapists in the middle of the day. So therapists love counseling centers because students fill their day practice. And we were able to piggyback off of the relationship that the counseling center had with these local mental health providers. And so a huge part of when you're building out a solution or a two-sided marketplace is you have to figure out, how am I going to, it doesn't matter how good my product is or how much value I can bring to someone if people don't know I exist. And so what we realized is that we can sell to what I call patient aggregators. And so by providing the University Counseling Center with something that was valuable to them, we could piggyback off the relationship that they had with these local mental health providers. And then the therapists would join the system because they cared about the counseling center, and then we could switch the relationship over to a relationship with MiResource. So I think when you're trying to build a two-sided marketplace, you're always going to have to solve for this chicken and the egg problem. And you're going to have to figure out a way to get someone to be the first group. And there's got to be another reason why they're going to be willing to sign up with you and stay on there, even if ultimately in the long run, the reason why you keep them on the platform is because you were able to fill out this other side of the marketplace. And then they have sort of more of an intertwined relationship, and they both keep each other within the marketplace. And that's hard to do. So I think that you want to make sure that that's something you think through if you're ever trying to build out a two-sided marketplace. So the next component to this is working with therapists and figuring out how can we get a group that is historically not technologically savvy to use technology, and for us to be able to keep their information up to date. And the key to making good connections between people and mental health providers is you have to understand lots of different components about the therapist that change frequently. For example, availability fluctuates quite frequently. So we have to figure out, how can we keep the availability piece up to date? Otherwise, it doesn't matter how good we are at matching. If we don't know who has availability, we can't help people get care. And you know, our initial thought was, okay, let's just build a system that is super user-friendly. So it'll take 2 seconds. The therapist will be naturally inclined to log in because they don't want to have a bunch of people calling them if they don't have availability in their practice. But I think something that's important to remember when you're trying to like design for incentives is that just because an incentive makes logical sense doesn't mean that people will actually care about it. And what we found is that there was another pain point that was conflicting with the therapist's desire to not be bombarded with calls, which is that they're very busy during the day and they also, I think, which is probably more important, is that they hate trying to remember passwords, which is something kind of obscure, but logging into any system created this mental barrier for them, in that even though it theoretically should only take me 5 seconds to log into the platform, update my availability, when the therapist is sitting there thinking about, oh, I've got to log into the system, what if I forget my password? It becomes a much bigger hurdle than it actually is. But you've got this psychological hurdle that doesn't necessarily map out to reality. But knowing that about who you're designing for is critical. And so a huge component of our product design process is we want to figure out how to get into the mindset of a therapist. What makes sense to therapists may not make sense to normal design principles. So designing for any other user on the internet didn't work when it came to designing for therapists, because there are all these weird little things that would always go wrong when a therapist used our system that wouldn't be on your radar to think about when you're designing for other demographics. So it's really important. I think our biggest learning was you have to almost come from a clean slate when we're designing for these different groups, and really map out what is living, eating, breathing, thinking, what does living feel, and what is that experience like within that specific demographic or that specific user profile. Because the normal rules of operating may not apply. And that's what we found. So for example, this is a funny example. So I take customer support calls all the time because it helps me stay very connected to how these therapists are thinking, and ultimately helps me make better decisions about where we're going in the future, because that you have to take into account all these little nuances. And so I was on the phone with a therapist, and they were saying to me that they hated our sign up process. It took them 45 minutes to do because they had to increase the amount per session. So we have like a little form where they can fill in what's the range that you charge patients per session. And there was, you could click on it and then type in the number, as you normally would fill out a form. And then our engineers threw in a little up and down number increaser so that you could like increase the number by clicking on a button. But because that button was there, we had a therapist that thought, oh, well, I can go in and I have to press the button. They didn't think they could click and type. They didn't try that. So, but the problem was that the number increaser only increased by penny increments. So, they're trying to get to like $120. So they're sitting there pressing the number increaser again and again and again and again. They spent 45 minutes trying to get the number in penny increments to total $120, which isn't something you would think of to check. But because, again, these therapists are difficult to design for sometimes, now that's something that's always on our radar. Is we always design each page with if there's one action that we want them to do, what is that one action? And now we're going to remove everything else that could possibly get in the way of them performing that one action. Anyways, I just threw a whole lot of information at all of you guys. So I'd love to know any questions or things that you'd like to learn more about.
I guess I can ask a quick question. So I think something that's really interesting that you've kind of mentioned throughout this is like, obviously with mental health resources or apps, there's a lot of like really hard, complex problems. So even as an example, just taking like, how can we make this user-friendly for therapists who like might not, be the most familiar with this technology? I was just kind of wondering how you personally take a big problem and like break it down into sub-problems, or how you kind of get started with such a like, I don't know, technically complex or difficult problem.
Yeah, so the way that we approach, I guess taking this back to when we very first started, being naive at the scope of the problem definitely worked to my favor, because I think if I knew how complicated the mental health care system was without knowing anything at the time, there's no way I would have tried to tackle this problem. But because I didn't understand the scope of it, I just started digging, and I kept digging and I kept digging, and I kind of learned the scope of the problem as I went. I think the benefit that I had that just coincidentally worked out well for me, not because I knew to do this at the time, was I didn't know I wanted to start a company when I started investigating the problem. I just wanted to understand the problem. And I think that we're so lucky that that was the case, because the mental health care system is so complicated. And I think arguably most systems are more complicated than we think. And there's a lot of nuance to it. And I think any problem is solvable if you can understand all of the different lenses of the problem. So think of all the different user groups and then breaking down those user groups into different segments. They all interact with the system in different ways. And I think to create large scale solutions to complex problems, you have to have a deep, deep, deep understanding of all of the nuance from all the different angles. And I think you have to come at that from I don't know anything about this space, and I'm going to learn about all the different perspectives. And sometimes the perspectives are going to be contradictory and not make any sense, but understanding that different people have different realities on the situation, and you have to solve for multiple perspectives at the same time. I think that's been our biggest strength and has enabled us to navigate the mental health care system and see how it all comes together and where we can slot into that system so that we can use all of the tools in the toolbox to try and solve this problem.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to check the chat here. Oh, awesome. Thanks, Michelle. Does anyone else have any questions? I think too, something that I talked about of doing these customer support calls, I think what's really helpful is when you start to build solutions to problems, the whole team is going to have insights and be constantly learning new things. And from a product development standpoint, one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten was to map out what is the sort of customer story of a specific perspective. So, and then you kind of create a story around it, almost like your own little Pixar movie that you can write down. So ours is called the Stress Student. So when we think about how do students go about thinking about getting mental health care, what is the process of them when they first consider going to get mental health care, and then what happens between then and them actually going to get mental health care. And so we did hundreds of interviews with students to figure out how they thought about this. And then we designed for the hardest, most common use case. Because if you start by solving for the hardest, most common use case, then you can easily tackle the easier use cases. So a more tangible probably example would be a friend of mine is a designer was a designer at Cruise. And so the way that she approaches at Cruise, they had this, their customer story was the morning commuter. And the morning commuter was in an urban setting because urban is harder to think through the different use cases. And for all of you guys that don't know, Cruise is an autonomous vehicle company. So being able to navigate a city as an autonomous vehicle presents a lot more challenges than out, in a rural area where there's less variables at play. The morning commuter was a woman trying to go to work in the morning during rush hour. So you're trying to throw in like what's the most common complex use cases. Then, if the daily commuter is then going home at night, there's just other safety concerns that you have to think about. So you're always trying to figure out what's the most common, hardest use case to solve for. And then everything else is going to be sort of blanketed in, and like your most hardest common use case will solve for all these other use cases as well. So that was really helpful advice. So for us, we always try and think about how can we solve for the harder problems first? So for us, that means we are targeting serious mental illness because that includes having to juggle complex mental health care. So you might need medication management plus talk therapy plus family therapy plus a residential program, or there's multiple layers. And when you're trying to help people who have like mild mental health concerns, the part of the treatment in that is a part of the more complex care. So it's very easy to do this if you can solve for the harder mental health care case first. All right, so I'm gonna look at some of these questions in the chat. Alan says, what is your favorite part of being the founder and working on MiResource daily? Oh, so many things, but I think the best part is getting to work on something that I know is helping people and kids like my sister not have to struggle in the way that she did. And that is the most rewarding thing. And if I can help one person not feel the pain that Shelby did, 100% worth it. And I think it's really important that if you do decide to ever start a company, that you do believe in it 5 billion% and love what it is that you're working on, because you're going to be working on things that in a vacuum you would hate doing normally. But when the problem that you're solving is powerful to you, then you don't even think, like I do all kinds of stuff that I normally wouldn't like to do, but because you can see it in the context of something bigger, you don't mind it at all. The other great part is being able to work with an amazing team. So I always try and be the least intelligent person in the room is always my goal. And so I get to learn every day from the most amazing people, and that is so much fun. All right, looking at another question. It wasn't there at the beginning of the talk, but did the responsibilities of the team change with the onset of COVID? We've always operated as a partially in-person, partially remote team. So the switch over to remote was not difficult for us, which we're really grateful for. COVID did affect us a lot because we work with university counseling centers, and universities, as you all know very intimately, really struggled during this. And it was fascinating because we work very closely with the counseling center and the student health departments, and different schools handle the pandemic in different ways. But to watch the health centers all of a sudden have not only their normal responsibilities, but this added task of trying to figure out how are we possibly going to handle the pandemic on top of this, was fascinating. The other thing is we sell our platform to schools, and a lot of their budgets got frozen, and forced us to think about our business model. And we have had to this date 100% bootstrapped our way to where we are today. So we really were relying on the revenue from counseling centers to keep us afloat. We're just closing a seed round right now. And our model was always going to change, but it helped us get there sooner. So I think COVID was a great push for us. The other benefit of COVID is it's actually done really interesting things for the mental health care field, because there's never been a time when we've talked so much about our mental health. It's done wonders, I think, for stigma. People were all, feeling lonely. We're all struggling, and that's totally normal because this is not a situation that really humans are designed for. But I think it's really helped bring mental wellness to a lot of people's radars where it may not have been before. The other cool thing for therapists is it's forced a lot of therapists to have to use Zoom or different video therapies. And I think it's surprised therapists how effective video calls can be for therapy in some instances, not for all instances, but it's helped a lot of therapists switch over to using more technology and being more comfortable with it, which is a great thing. Okay, so I see another question. How do you deal with working with large teams? I can work in small teams fine, but there's something strange to me about managing large teams and making sure everything is well coordinated. Structure and systems and communication, and I think being really well organized in the way, and being well organized doesn't mean more bureaucracy. It just means having a system and having that system very explicitly outlined and making sure that people follow it. And you can change that system. And I think it's really important that, well, at least at MiResource, the way we operate is everything is up for discussion. We are constantly suggesting new ideas and how we change our processes. We like to operate on what I call an idea meritocracy, where we're always throwing ideas forward and the best idea should win. And we're always debating it. And we highly encourage each other to challenge everything. Groupthink is what you're trying to avoid. But we do have very specific systems and ways of operating, even if those are changing and are always up for discussion. There's always a plan and a way of doing things. So it allows for people to have autonomy and to collaborate, but for things to stay organized so you can retain some of that small team feel, even if you're working with larger teams. I know I just covered a lot. Does anyone have any more questions? Don't be shy about turning on your camera and talking over the mic. One thing that I think is interesting is feel like they should teach a class at university on effective communication and like team structure, because you have to, I mean, I'm sure there's some job that I'm not thinking of right now that doesn't require collaboration with others, but for pretty much everything, you're working with people, communicating ideas, and trying to identify the way to structure things and how to disagree with people and challenge ideas in a way that makes everyone feel appreciated. And that's, we're always working on team projects at university or even in lower levels of school. I always personally hated team projects because I felt like I always ended up doing all the work. But if I push myself to learn how to motivate others, you get like leadership skills on steroids if you really like pushed yourself to figure out how to motivate your teammates. I mean, the rest of life would be a breeze. But you're never thinking about it from that perspective. And I feel like it would be incredible if we were taught that at a younger age. I don't know, food for thought.
I've got a quick question. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So it seems like your resources, like the project you've been working on, is like a great way for people to get accessible, like or access to a reference almost, or know where to go next. And I have a very limited experience with like my university's health services, but do you see any feasible idea of yours? I don't know. I don't want to use this sounds bad, but like almost your system could be specialized for each university depending on what's in their area, and almost, I don't know, replace or take a lot of the responsibility for what currently they're done. Because my experience very limited, I'll say, albeit, so I may not know the experience of maybe there's more to know than I know, but it seems that a lot of the current mental health services are a lot of referral stuff, and it's very, and otherwise limited to mostly directing students where to go next. So I was wondering about how your resource can fit in there.
So that's a great question. And that's what we do, is that counseling centers don't have enough therapists on staff to be able to service everyone who wants care. So what they've tried to do to be able to help people get connected to care is they've switched to what's called a step model, where when you go into the counseling center, they're going to try and help you identify what you're struggling with and then figure out what's the right type of care track to place you on. So whether that is, if you decide, I want to see a therapist regularly, then they're going to connect you to a local mental health provider. And that's where our system comes into play, is we want to make sure that the clinician that you're connected with meets everything that you need, and is someone that you feel comfortable talking with, and is someone that fits in your schedule, that you can afford, that you can get to regularly, and any other sort of things that are specifically important to you. And so what we do is we help the counseling center. What's interesting is the counseling centers tend to have great insights into who the local clinicians are and where good therapists are in the local area. They just have a really hard time keeping track of all those clinicians. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because in mental health care, what's really challenging about clinician networks is that they're not a part of greater health systems. Like if you think about like a knee doctor or a physical therapist, they tend to be a part of, they have, administrative support and other support institutions around them that manage their schedule, handle their billing, do their marketing. But therapists are oftentimes just themselves. They're their own business. They have to handle all their marketing, all of their billing, all of the administrative stuff, all the scheduling. And so it's really difficult to keep track of these therapists. And so that's what MiResource does, is we help the counseling center keep all that information on those clinicians up to date and collect lots of data points so that they can connect people to care that meets all their needs, that they can reliably get to, that can actually see them. So that's exactly what we do. Keenan, did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. I was great. It answered my question perfectly, because I was asking if it was seen as replacement. I'm hearing, no, we're not trying to replace. We're trying to add another resource that's missing. It's great to hear.
And actually what we're trying to do is the counseling center, like the work that they have to do are oftentimes like easier referrals to people who know that they want care. They may not know what they're struggling with, but it's easy for the counseling center to identify what it is and help route them to care. But the problem is there's also students who are struggling quite intensely and really could use more of a handheld experience in helping them identify the right care, and really need someone that can really be there for them every step of the way. And that's something that software can't augment. So counseling centers actually want us to replace the kind of easier work for them. So we were just awarded a $1.2 million grant from the NIH to build and clinically validate a machine learning triage model that can prove that we can connect people to care as effectively as these human referral coordinators. And what that's going to do is it's going to give everyone access to this really amazing handheld experience and being able to help you figure out exactly what care you need. But instead of having to go to the counseling center, you can just go through our guided search and do that. And we have version 1 of that up and running right now that basically maps out. It takes all the existing research and fuses that into our system, but it requires you to kind of know what you want, whereas this new matching algorithm can basically figure that out for you without you having to know that. And the beauty of that is that frees up all this time for these human referral coordinators to be able to be way more hands-on with people who really need that human touch, which is an amazing thing. And what's so special about counseling centers, and that they do have people that are totally dedicated to being there for students. And that's what the counseling centers and these referral coordinators want to do. And going back to another question that someone asked earlier about what's my favorite part about working on MiResource, these research meetings with our scientific team is like one of my favorite things. It's so much fun to learn about all these really phenomenally cool things that we can do with technology and our platform. I think that's what's really fun about what we're building and exciting, is that we're really trying to get the full data picture on clinicians and the decision-making process and how do we connect people to the right care. And when you have the full data set, there's so much fun things you can do with machine learning and the data analysis, and it gets super, super exciting. I think that's also been a big learning, which might be obvious to all of you since you're all experts at this. But for me, I wish if I could go back and do version 1 again. It's so critically important because, again, you're going to give it your best shot and try and learn as much as you can. But at the end of the day, you're going to be wrong. Like, you're never going to build it right the first time. And so being able to measure what it is that you're trying to accomplish and see the data from that is critical. And we didn't have that capabilities at the beginning. And I think we could have iterated a lot faster and gotten to where we are today much faster if we had built in the measurement tooling and really prioritized that from the get-go. So I can't stress enough how important it is that everything you do is measurable, especially, if you identify what is the key objective that I'm trying to have someone do, you have to be able to see if they're doing it or not. Otherwise, you're never going to know if it's working.
I guess I can ask another question. One question that I kind of had was, so I assume kind of with MiResource growing and like maybe expanding to like multiple universities, like multiple different sites, I was wondering like how you deal with issues surrounding scalability, and also just kind of like where you see MiResource growing next.
Yeah, so I think I worried about scalability too much from the beginning, and I wish I hadn't. It was really helpful once we got traction and started scaling, that I didn't have as many scalability growing pains, but I think we could have gotten ultimately to where we're going faster if we hadn't worried about scalability from the get-go. And I think that is the biggest mistake I see first-time founders making. The exact same mistake I made myself, is I thought I had to build a scalable solution out of the gates. But going back to what I just mentioned about being able to measure, and that you're gonna build the wrong product, the first time, no matter how much research you do. So you kind of, to some degree, you got to put in your homework and learn about the system, but then you just got to build something so you can see how people interact with it, and then make changes from there. And I built what I thought was a scalable solution from the get-go, and it was scalable to some degree, but then you inevitably make changes and have to change the product. And I think there's so many things that can go wrong before you get to the point where you have to be scalable. And so your likelihood that the product that you first build is the product that you're going to need to figure out how to scale is like very low. So if you focus on how can I get something out there that I can test that isn't scalable, that may require me to do a bunch of back end work, even if I'm saying that the product can do it all on its own. Or you're promising a certain service, and you don't want to lie about what your product can and can't do. But if you're saying I can accomplish X, even if that means you yourself are having to do all those steps manually, you're going to learn so much about the way that people really want to interact with your product. And then you'll know just from having to do it again and again, how you can automate that, but in the way that works the best for the system. And so what we did is we built, a scalable product, but it wasn't really the right product. So then we had to change the product, and we're just redoing the entire code stack to launch, a system that is fully automated in the way that our users want, but we had to rebuild the entire thing from scratch. And so if we had built a less scalable solution initially, then we could have probably built the scalable solution and probably wouldn't be having to rebuild the entire thing from scratch today.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
I think once the scaling part's actually pretty easy. I think that's the easier problem to solve. I think figuring out the exact way that your customers want to interact with your product and what they really want from your product is the harder piece. So I would worry more about that than the scalability piece. Like automating systems, once you know what those systems are pretty easy to do.
Cool. It's been about 45 minutes, so maybe we'll take like one last question if someone from the audience has it. If not, thank you so much, Mackenzie, for coming and talking to us for so long.